The northern wind sweeps across the stone valley. Once, more than 5,000 people lived here. Norse settlers who crossed the Atlantic in wooden ships, who built farms from rock and grass, who raised children in the shadow of glaciers. Now only ruins remain. Stone walls still standing after 600 years. Empty doorways facing the sea. And silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder what happened to all those voices, all those lives, all those families who called this frozen land home. They did not leave in a single night. There was no great battle, no volcano, no earthquake that wiped them out in an instant. They simply faded away, year by year, generation by generation, until one day there was no one left. The last Viking in Greenland died alone, and no one wrote down when or how or why. The ships from Europe stopped coming. The churches fell silent. The farms returned to grass and stone, and the world forgot they had ever been there. This is the story of the last Vikings of Greenland, not a tale of glorious conquest or heroic last stands, but something far more unsettling. A story of how an entire civilization, one that survived for 500 years in one of Earth's harshest environments, could vanish so completely that even their ending remains a mystery. To understand how they disappeared, we must first understand who they were, and what made them believe they could survive in a place the Inuit people call Kalalit Nunaat, the land of ice. For us today, Vikings are almost legend, horned helmets, dragon ships, warriors who feared nothing. But the real Vikings were farmers, traders, families looking for land. And in the year 985 AD, a man named Erik the Red stood on the deck of his ship and pointed west. He had been exiled from Iceland for murder. He needed a new home. He had sailed for 3 years exploring the coastline of a massive island covered in ice. And now he was returning with a story and a name. He called it Greenland. Not because it was green, but because he needed people to follow him there. 25 ships set sail from Iceland that summer. Families packed everything they owned into wooden hulls barely 15 meters long. Livestock, tools, seeds, children. They sailed into the open Atlantic, following Erik's wake toward an island most had never seen. The crossing took weeks. Storms scattered the fleet. Some ships turned back. Others simply vanished beneath the waves. Only 14 ships reached Greenland's western shore. But those who survived found something unexpected. Fjords protected from the wind. Valleys with grass growing thick in the summer sun. And most importantly, no one else there to claim it. They built their settlements in 2 main clusters. The eastern settlement, the larger of the two, nestled in the southern tip where the climate was mildest. Over 100 farms spread across the valleys, each one a collection of stone and turf buildings grouped around a main hall. The western settlement sat further north, smaller but still substantial, with perhaps 30 farms carved into the landscape. Between them, in the peak years of the 13th century, lived nearly 5,000 Norse men, women, and children. For them, this was not a frozen wasteland. This was their promised land, their new world, their chance to build something that would last. Daily life in Norse Greenland was built on a simple foundation: livestock. Every farm kept cattle, sheep, and goats. The cows provided milk for cheese and butter. The sheep gave wool for clothing and trade. The animals were everything: wealth, food, warmth, status. A wealthy farmer might own 30 head of cattle, a poor one perhaps 5. They grazed in the valleys during the brief summer, and in winter they were brought into stone barns connected to the main house. The family slept in one end, the animals in the other. Body heat from the livestock helped warm the humans through the brutal Arctic nights. But farming alone could not sustain them. The Vikings of Greenland were part of a larger world, connected by trade routes that stretched across the North Atlantic to Europe. Their most valuable export was walrus ivory. Teams of hunters would sail north in summer, camping for weeks on the ice edge, hunting the massive animals for their tusks. Those tusks, some over a meter long, were loaded onto ships and sent to Norway, then onward to the workshops of Europe where craftsmen carved them into chess pieces, religious reliquaries, and ornaments for the wealthy. In return, Greenland received what it could not produce: timber for building and repairs, iron for tools and nails, wheat flour and luxury goods. They imported everything that their island lacked. Wood was precious beyond measure. Greenland had no forests, only low shrubs and grass. Every timber beam in every building had either drifted ashore from distant forests or been shipped at great expense from Scandinavia. Iron came the same way. A single iron knife represented months of trade goods. But the Vikings made it work. They built houses from stone and turf, thick walls that could withstand the wind. They used driftwood wherever possible. They reused and repaired everything. And in their churches, built of imported timber and local stone, they prayed to the Christian God who they believed had led them to this place. The settlements had churches, 17 of them at the peak, including a small cathedral at Gardar in the eastern settlement. Priests and bishops were sent from Norway to tend to their souls. The Greenlanders paid their tithes in walrus ivory and sealskins. They sent their children to be educated in Norway. They considered themselves not isolated outcasts, but proud members of Christendom, Norse subjects of the Norwegian crown, inheritors of a culture that stretched from Dublin to the gates of Constantinople. And for nearly 3 centuries, that world worked. It held together. It thrived. The reason it worked was simple. The climate allowed it. From roughly the 10th to the 13th century, the Earth experienced what historians now call the medieval warm period. Temperatures across the North Atlantic were 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the centuries before or after. That difference sounds small, but in Greenland it meant everything. It meant summers long enough for grass to grow thick. It meant sea ice that retreated far enough for ships to navigate safely. It meant that livestock could survive the winter without starving. It meant that the world, for a brief moment in geological time, was designed for them. Picture a farm in the eastern settlement in the year 1250. The fields are green. Children play near the stone walls while their mother cards wool in the doorway. The farmer is repairing a fence, using driftwood he collected last month. His cattle graze peacefully in the valley. A ship from Norway arrived 3 weeks ago, bringing iron nails, grain, and news from the old country. Tomorrow he will take a load of dried fish and seal oil to the trading post. Life is hard, yes. Winter will come soon, and it will be brutal. But this is home. His grandfather is buried on the hill behind the church. His children will inherit this land. The farm will endure. The settlement will endure. They have no reason to think otherwise. But the world, as always, was about to change. The Earth never stands still. Climate shifts constantly, cycling between warm and cold across centuries and millennia. What humans experience as permanent is merely a snapshot, a brief moment in geological time. And in the late 13th century, that moment began to end. The medieval warm period, which had made Greenland habitable for Norse farmers, was fading. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, temperatures began to drop. Not in a single catastrophic winter, but degree by degree, decade by decade. The change was so gradual that no single generation could see it clearly. But it was happening. And for a civilization built on the edge of survival, even small changes would prove fatal. Around the year 1280, the first signs appeared. Summers became slightly shorter. The grass did not grow quite as thick. Winters lasted a few weeks longer. The sea ice, which used to retreat in early summer, now lingered until July. Ships from Norway that once arrived in May now came in August, if they came at all. These were subtle shifts, A farmer watching his fields might notice that the hay harvest was smaller this year than last. But hay harvests fluctuate. Weather varies. It was easy to believe that next year would be better, that this was just a bad season, not the beginning of something worse. But the cold kept coming. By 1300, the climate had shifted noticeably. The average temperature had dropped by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. In most places, that would be barely noticeable. But in Greenland, perched at the edge of the Arctic, that difference meant the line between survival and starvation. The growing season, which had been just long enough for grass to reach full height, was now too short. Pastures that once fed 30 cattle could now support 20. Sheep that used to gain weight through the summer now struggled to survive. And in winter, when feed ran low and cold pressed in from all sides, animals began to die in larger numbers. Imagine you are a farmer in the eastern settlement in the year 1310. Your father told you stories of his grandfather's time, when grass grew waist-high by July, when the herds were fat and healthy, when ships arrived reliably every summer. You have never seen that world. The grass now barely reaches your knees. Last winter you lost 8 sheep to starvation and cold. This year you have already lost 12, and winter has barely begun. Your neighbor lost half his cattle. The farmer up the valley has abandoned 2 of his 3 fields because the yields no longer justify the work. And the ship from Norway, the one that brings iron and timber and connects you to the wider world, has not come for 3 years now. The Vikings tried to adapt. They always had. That was how they survived in this harsh place for 3 centuries. They began eating more fish and seal meat, though their culture traditionally preferred farming to fishing. They hunted more aggressively along the coast, taking seals and seabirds and whatever else the sea provided. They slaughtered more livestock before winter, drying and preserving the meat so fewer animals needed to be fed through the coldest months. They tightened their belts and told themselves this was temporary, that the warm years would return, that God was testing them and faith would see them through. But adaptation has limits. The Norse culture of Greenland was built around farming and livestock. Their entire social structure, their wealth, their identity depended on cattle and sheep. A man's status was measured by the size of his herd. Land was valuable only if it could support animals. The whole system assumed a certain baseline of climate stability, and that baseline was disappearing. They could eat more seal meat, yes, but that required boats and hunting skills they had not maintained. They could try to trade for more food. But with what? Walrus ivory was their only significant export, and hunting walruses required sailing far north into increasingly dangerous ice-choked waters. The changing climate brought more than hunger. Warmer winters, paradoxically, meant more disease. Before, the extreme cold killed parasites and limited the spread of infections. But the new pattern of less harsh winters meant insects survived longer. Ticks and flies multiplied. Diseases that had been rare began to spread through weakened animals and malnourished humans. The shallow graves of this period, excavated by archaeologists centuries later, show evidence of tuberculosis, joint disease, and malnutrition. The skeletons tell a story of people who were slowly, over generations, getting shorter, weaker, sicker. The average height of Norse Greenlanders decreased by 5 centimeters between 1250 and 1400, a clear marker of nutritional stress. For an individual living through these decades, the change might not seem dramatic. One bad year followed by a slightly less bad year. A hard winter followed by a mediocre summer. You adapt. You survive. You hope next year will be better. But if you could step back and see the centuries, the pattern becomes clear. The herds were shrinking. The farms were producing less. The population was slowly declining. Some families abandoned their land and moved to larger settlements, seeking safety in numbers. Other farms simply went silent. The people died, or left, or gave up. And gradually, the map of Norse Greenland began to have empty spaces where once there had been homes. But hunger was not the only threat. The Norse Greenlanders faced a second crisis, one perhaps even more devastating than climate change. They were losing their connection to the outside world. For 3 centuries, Greenland had survived not because it was self-sufficient, but because it was part of a network. Ships brought what the island could not provide. Trade maintained their economy. Cultural ties to Norway and Europe gave them identity and purpose. But in the 14th century, that network began to unravel. And when the last thread finally snapped, the Greenlanders found themselves alone in a way they had never been before. Isolated, forgotten, cut off from the civilization they had worked so hard to remain part of. The walrus ivory trade collapsed first. For generations, Greenlandic ivory had been Europe's primary source for carving luxury goods. Tusks harvested from the icy waters of the far north were shipped to workshops in Cologne, Paris, and London, where master craftsmen transformed them into chess pieces, crucifixes, and ornamental boxes for the wealthy. The trade was so important that Greenlanders paid their church tithes in ivory. It was their currency, their connection to the wider world. But in the mid-14th century, everything changed. African elephant ivory began flooding into European markets. Portuguese traders had opened new routes along the African coast, bringing ivory that was larger, whiter, easier to work with, and far more abundant than anything from the Arctic. Almost overnight, Greenlandic walrus ivory became worthless. The market that had sustained the settlements for 300 years simply vanished. Hunters still went north each summer, still risked their lives on the ice edge, still brought back tusks. But there was no one to sell them to. No merchant ships arrived to carry them away. The tusks piled up in warehouses, unsold, while the families who had hunted them went hungry. Without ivory, Greenland had nothing to trade. Without trade, they could not import the iron, timber, and grain they needed to survive. The economic foundation of the settlements had been kicked away, and everything built upon it began to collapse. Then came the Black Death. In 1347, plague swept into Europe from Asia, killing perhaps half the continent's population over the next 4 years. Norway, Greenland's mother country and trading partner, was devastated. Entire villages emptied. Ships sat rotting in harbors because there were no crews to sail them. The Norwegian merchants who had maintained the Atlantic trade routes died by the thousands, and the survivors had more pressing concerns than a distant colony in the Arctic. The ships that once sailed to Greenland every summer, bringing supplies and news and connection, simply stopped coming. The year 1362 saw one documented voyage. After that, silence. For the Greenlanders, the absence of ships meant more than just missing goods. It meant losing their place in the world. In 1377, the last priest ordained in Norway was sent to Greenland. He never returned. No letters arrived from him. No reports reached the church authorities in Trondheim. And after waiting years, the church simply stopped sending priests. By 1400, Greenland had vanished from European consciousness. Maps still showed it. Old records mentioned it. But to the living, breathing world of late medieval Europe, the settlements might as well have been on another planet. They had become a memory of a place that used to matter before plague and economic shifts and the simple passage of time erased them from importance. While Norse Greenland weakened, another group was moving south. The Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, had been spreading east across Arctic Canada for centuries. They were specialized hunters, perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions in ways the Norse never were. They hunted from kayaks using toggle harpoons. They built igloos and skin tents that could be moved with the seasons. They wore furs and ate seal meat without the cultural baggage that made the Norse reluctant to abandon their farming identity. And sometime in the 13th century, they reached Greenland's northern coast and began moving south toward the Norse settlements. The two cultures were about to meet. The archaeological evidence suggests limited contact. A few Norse items found in Inuit sites, some Inuit tools discovered in Norse ruins. The Icelandic annals mention conflicts, describing raids and violence, but there is no evidence of large-scale warfare, no massacre sites, no mass graves. The Inuit were not invaders seeking to conquer. They were simply better suited to the environment. They could thrive where the Norse struggled. They could hunt seals efficiently while the Norse starved. And their very existence posed an uncomfortable question to the Greenlanders. If these newcomers could live successfully in this land, why couldn't the Norse? What did the Inuit have that they lacked? The answer was painful. The Inuit had cultural flexibility. They could adapt their tools, their diet, their entire way of life to match the environment. The Norse could not, or would not. They clung to their identity as European farmers, as cattle-raising Christians, as subjects of the Norwegian crown. To adopt Inuit methods would mean admitting they were no longer Norse. It would mean abandoning everything that made them who they were. So they held on to their failing farms, their hungry cattle, their empty churches waiting for priests who would never come. They chose cultural identity over survival. And in the Arctic, that choice has only one end. By the mid-14th century, the pattern was clear. The climate had shifted permanently colder. The trade routes were dead. The population was declining. But for the people living through it, clarity is a luxury. They saw only their own lives, their own farms, their own daily struggles. They could not step back and see the larger picture, that their civilization was in its final chapter. And so they continued, year after year, doing what their ancestors had done, raising cattle and sheep, maintaining farms, going to church, trying to hold on to a way of life that the world no longer supported. Until one day in the Western settlement, everyone was simply gone. The last documented visit to the Western settlement was recorded in 1341. A ship arrived from the Eastern settlement, perhaps 30 or 40 kilometers south by sea. The crew found something disturbing: empty farms, houses with doors standing open, livestock wandering free with no one to tend them, hay left rotting in storage, but no people, no bodies, no signs of violence or plague, just absence. The visitors took the livestock, rounded up what cattle and sheep they could find, and sailed back to the Eastern settlement with a mystery they could not solve. Where had everyone gone? Had they died? Fled south to the larger settlement? Sailed away in boats that sank in the crossing? The record is silent. What happened in the Western settlement remains unknown. But we can imagine the years leading up to that empty moment. 50 farms reduced to 30, then 20, then 10. Families dying without heirs, children too weak to survive their first winter, old people going to sleep and not waking, and the survivors, those who remained, watching their community shrink around them. At some point, a terrible calculation must have been made. The settlement was no longer viable. Too few people to maintain the infrastructure. Too little trade to justify staying. Too much isolation to endure. And so the last families made a choice. They packed what they could carry, slaughtered what animals they could not take, and walked away from homes their grandparents had built. The Eastern settlement lasted longer. It was larger, more established, better positioned in the slightly milder southern climate, but it faced the same inevitable decline. By 1400, the population had crashed from thousands to perhaps 200 or 300. The farms that once numbered over 100 were reduced to scattered handfuls of occupied buildings surrounded by ruins. The church at Valsey, one of the largest and finest in all Greenland, still stood. Its thick stone walls were impervious to time. But the congregation that once filled it was gone. Services were held, perhaps a dozen families attending. If that. Prayers echoed in empty space, where once there had been community. Imagine you are born in the Eastern settlement in the year 1400. You have never seen a ship from Europe. That world exists only in stories your grandmother tells, tales of when the merchants came, when there were priests, when Greenland was connected to something larger than itself. You grow up in a settlement of perhaps 30 households, scattered across valleys that once held hundreds. Everyone is related to you. Your cousin married your other cousin because there was no one else. Your uncle is also your grandfather's brother's son. the gene pool has become so small that deformities are common. Children are born weak. Many do not survive their first year, and those who do carry the accumulated burden of generations of inbreeding. The archaeological evidence tells the story that no written records preserved. Excavations of graves from this period reveal malnutrition so severe it stunted growth and deformed bones. The average height of adults had decreased by 5 centimeters from their ancestors. Teeth show signs of extreme vitamin deficiency. The nitrogen isotope analysis of bone collagen reveals a dramatic shift in diet. By the 15th century, the Norse Greenlanders were deriving 90% of their nutrition from the sea, from fish and seals and seabirds. But this was not by choice. This was desperation. They had been forced to abandon the farming identity that defined them and become what they had always resisted being: people of the sea. But even that adaptation came too late and too reluctantly. The Inuit, with centuries of specialized knowledge, could thrive on a marine diet. The Norse, lacking that expertise, merely survived. They ate seal meat, but did not know how to render seal oil efficiently. They caught fish, but their preservation techniques were inferior. They hunted, but their boats and weapons were designed for a different way of life. One excavation revealed something particularly telling: seal bones with butchering marks that showed the Norse were eating parts of the animal that Inuit hunters would discard, the lowest quality meat, the scraps. They were eating like starving people because they were starving people. Pride and cultural identity had kept them from learning what they needed to know, and by the time desperation forced change, it was too late. Disease ravaged what malnutrition weakened. Skeletal remains show evidence of tuberculosis, a disease that spreads easily in crowded, poorly ventilated conditions. The Norse lived in their dark, smoky houses with livestock at one end and family at the other. Perfect conditions for respiratory disease. Joint diseases suggest people working their bodies beyond sustainable limits, desperate to maintain farms that could no longer support them. And perhaps most heartbreaking, the graves of infants and small children far outnumber those of healthy adults. This was a community dying from the bottom up. The children, who should have been the future, could not survive the present. And without children, there is no future at all. The last written record from Norse Greenland is dated September 1408. It describes a wedding. Thorstein Olafsson married Sigrid Bjornsdottir in the church at Valsey. Witnesses signed the document. The ceremony followed proper church protocol. Someone carefully recorded the details as if it mattered, as if anyone beyond Greenland would ever read it. Perhaps it was an act of defiance. Perhaps it was simply habit, the continuation of tradition, because tradition was all they had left. Or perhaps it was hope, the belief that if they maintained the forms of civilization, civilization itself might survive. But after that wedding document, nothing. No more records, no more letters, no more proof that anyone remained alive. When did the last person die? The question haunts historians. Was it 1450? 1480? Some optimistic estimates suggest Norse Greenlanders might have survived into the early 1500s, but the truth is no one knows. No one was there to record it. No ship arrived to find the final empty settlement. The end came in silence, in isolation, in a place that the rest of the world had already forgotten. Perhaps it was an old woman, the last survivor of her generation, dying alone in a stone house as winter closed in. Perhaps it was a small family, father and mother and child, who simply failed to wake one morning. Perhaps they tried to sail away, and the ocean took them. We will never know. What we do know is what the ruins tell us. When European explorers rediscovered the settlements in the 18th century, they found houses with household goods still inside. Looms with half-finished weaving, knives on tables, wooden crosses on walls, as if the inhabitants had stepped out for a moment and never returned. But 600 years of ice and wind had passed. The roofs had collapsed, the wooden elements had rotted. What remained was stone, the bones of a civilization that had tried to plant itself in soil too harsh to sustain it. And in the churchyard at Valsey, beneath markers that had long since fallen, lay the bodies of the dead. Hundreds of them. Generations of people who had lived and loved and suffered in this place. One particularly moving discovery was made in the 1920s. Archaeologists excavating a farm found, tucked into a corner of a collapsed building, a small wooden doll, crudely carved, barely 10 centimeters tall. A child's toy. Whoever owned it had left it behind when the farm was abandoned. Or perhaps the child had died, and the grief-stricken parents could not bear to bury it with their daughter. The doll sat there for 6 centuries, a remnant of something as simple and universal as childhood play. In the grand narrative of civilizations rising and falling, of climate change and economic collapse, it is easy to forget the individual moments. But that doll reminds us, these were not statistics. They were people. And one of them was a little girl who played with a wooden toy. The Norse Greenlanders did not fail because they were weak or stupid or cowardly. They failed because they were human. They could not see the future clearly. They could not abandon their identity, even when that identity became a death sentence. They made rational choices based on the information they had and the values they held. Stay on the land your ancestors bled for. Maintain the culture that defines you. Trust that God and perseverance will see you through. These were not foolish beliefs. They had worked for 3 centuries. But the world changed, and those beliefs, once strengths, became fatal flaws. And by the time they realized adaptation was necessary, they lacked the resources and population to adapt successfully. The last Viking in Greenland died without knowing they were the last. For them, it was just another winter, another season of cold and hunger. They did not know that no spring would follow, that no children would be born next year, that the settlements their ancestors built would stand empty forever. They died believing perhaps that someone would remember them, that their sacrifice and suffering meant something, that the world would know they had existed. But for 500 years, the world forgot. The ruins stood silent. The graves went unmarked. And the story of the last Vikings became a mystery, a puzzle that historians would spend centuries trying to solve. Not because their ending was dramatic, but because it was so quiet, so complete, so utterly, terribly final. But the Norse Greenlanders did not disappear entirely. Not from the Earth's memory. The permafrost preserved them. For centuries after the last Viking died, their possessions remained frozen in time, buried under collapsed roofs and accumulating snow. Their houses stood, slowly crumbling but recognizable. Their churches, built of imported timber and local stone, weathered the storms. And their bodies lay in the graveyards, waiting in the frozen ground, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to ask what happened. Waiting, in a sense, to tell their story one final time to a world that had long forgotten they existed. The rediscovery came slowly. In 1721, a Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede sailed to Greenland, hoping to find the lost Norse settlements and convert any surviving Christians. What he found instead were Inuit people who had no memory of the Vikings except vague stories of people they called the Kavdlunait, the foreigners. Egede searched the coastline and eventually located the ruins of the eastern settlement. Stone walls, empty churches, graveyards with wooden crosses rotted to nothing. The buildings were intact enough that he could see how people had lived, but of the people themselves, nothing remained. The civilization that had lasted 500 years had vanished so completely that even the local inhabitants did not know when or how it ended. Over the next 2 centuries, explorers and archaeologists gradually mapped and excavated the sites. What they found was extraordinary. 400 farms spread across the two settlements. 17 churches, including the cathedral at Gardar with its foundation measuring 27 meters long. Hundreds of graves in churchyards at Valsi, Bratahlid, and dozens of smaller sites. The scale of the ruins proved this had been no small outpost, no temporary camp. This was a full society, a civilization that had planted deep roots in Arctic soil, and the level of preservation in the cold, dry climate meant that objects survived which would have rotted away anywhere else. Objects that brought the Norse Greenlanders back to life. In the collapsed houses, archaeologists found the intimate details of daily existence. Bone combs carved with intricate patterns, used to keep hair neat in a land where appearance and status mattered. Wooden crosses hung on walls, some small enough to fit in a palm, proof of faith maintained even in isolation. Clothing made from wool, remarkably preserved, showing the quality of their weaving and the patches they had sewn when fabric became too precious to discard. Knives, spindles, loom weights, all the tools of a farming culture trying to maintain itself at the edge of the world. And in some houses, wooden toys, carved animals, simple dolls, evidence that even in the hardest times, parents tried to give their children moments of play. The most valuable discoveries came from the graves. In the permanently frozen ground, bodies that should have decomposed had instead mummified. Archaeologists could examine skin, hair, clothing, even stomach contents, and what they found told a story more powerful than any written record. These were not the tall, healthy Vikings of popular imagination. The skeletons showed severe malnutrition, curved spines from a lifetime of heavy labor, joint disease from working in cold, damp conditions, teeth worn down and riddled with cavities, evidence of tuberculosis in the ribs, and perhaps most telling, the bones were small, much smaller than their ancestors from 3 centuries earlier. The average height had decreased by 5 centimeters, clear evidence of generational nutritional stress. Modern scientific techniques revealed even more. DNA analysis showed extremely limited genetic diversity in the final generations, proof that the population had shrunk to dangerous levels where everyone was related. Isotope analysis of bone collagen could determine what they ate throughout their lives. The results were startling. Early Norse Greenlanders derived perhaps 30% of their diet from the sea. But by the 15th century, that number had risen to 80 or 90%. They had become dependent on fish, seal, and seabirds. The farming culture that defined their identity had failed, and they had been forced to adopt a marine diet just to survive. But they adopted it badly, without the specialized knowledge the Inuit possessed. One particularly revealing find came from a midden, a garbage heap, at a late-period farm. Among the seal bones were pieces that Inuit hunters would never have eaten, parts with little meat and no nutritional value. The butchering marks showed inexpert work, desperate cutting. These were people eating seal meat, not because they had mastered Arctic hunting, but because they had nothing else. The archaeological evidence painted a picture of a slow-motion catastrophe, of a people watching their world collapse and trying everything they could think of to survive. They ate different food, they changed their farming practices, they abandoned outlying settlements to concentrate in the core. But nothing was enough. The ruins themselves became a kind of memorial. When you walk through the remains of a Norse Greenland farm today, you can still see the layout clearly. The long house with its thick stone walls, the barn attached at one end where livestock sheltered, the small outbuildings for storage, the irrigation channels they dug to bring water to their fields, the stone fences they built to mark property boundaries. All of it speaks to enormous effort, to generations of labor, to the determination to make this place work. They were not passing through. They intended to stay forever. And the fact that forever lasted only 500 years does not diminish what they built. It makes it more poignant, more human, a monument to ambition meeting the limits of adaptation. Every artifact found in Norse Greenland carries weight beyond its physical presence. A wooden comb is not just a comb. It represents trade networks that brought the wood, craftsmanship that shaped it, a person who used it daily, who cared about their appearance even as their world fell apart. A child's toy is not just a carved piece of wood. It is a parent's love, a moment of play, a childhood that ended too soon. A cross on a wall is not just a religious symbol. It is faith maintained in isolation, prayers offered to a God who seemed not to answer, the last connection to a Christian world that had abandoned them. These objects are not curiosities. They are evidence of human lives, as real and complex as our own. The story that emerges from the archaeology is clear. The Norse Greenlanders did not fail because they were ignorant or weak. They failed because they could not let go of who they were. They were farmers in a land that would no longer support farming. They were European Christians in a place where European culture had no meaning. They needed to become something else, something hybrid, something adapted to Arctic conditions. The Inuit showed it was possible. But the Norse could not make that leap. To adopt Inuit methods would mean admitting they were no longer Norse, and that admission, that loss of identity, was more terrifying than death itself. So they held on, and they died holding on. And centuries later, we excavate their graves and wonder if we would have chosen differently. The ruins raise an obvious question, one that haunts anyone who studies Norse Greenland. Why didn't they leave? They were seafaring people. Their ancestors had crossed the Atlantic in open boats. They knew the route back to Iceland, back to Norway. Ships had made that journey for 3 centuries, when the climate turned against them, when the farms failed, when the population dwindled. Why did they stay? Why did they choose to die in Greenland rather than sail back to a world where survival was easier? The question seems simple, but the answer reveals something profound about human nature, about identity, about the terrible weight of decisions delayed too long. The practical obstacles were real. By the 14th century, Greenland had no forests. Every piece of timber had to be imported or salvaged from driftwood. Building an ocean-going ship, the kind capable of carrying families and livestock across the North Atlantic, required large quantities of quality wood. A single ship needed planks 20 meters long for the keel, plus ribs, masts, oars, and decking. The Norse Greenlanders no longer had access to those materials. Their existing ships were aging. Wood that had lasted decades in the cold climate was finally rotting, splitting, becoming unseaworthy. And there was no way to replace them. Even basic repairs were difficult when every nail was precious. Without ships, leaving became nearly impossible. A small boat, a fishing vessel, might carry 6 or 8 people across to Iceland if conditions were perfect. But perfect conditions in the North Atlantic are rare. The voyage took weeks. Storms could scatter a fleet in hours. Ice could crush a hull. A single miscalculation meant drowning in water so cold that death came in minutes. And even if a boat did reach Iceland, what then? The passengers would arrive as refugees, possessing nothing, dependent on charity in a land dealing with its own climate and economic struggles. For a farming family with children, elderly parents, years of accumulated possessions, the risk was almost unthinkable. Better to stay where you had land, even failing land, than to gamble everything on an ocean crossing that might end in death. But the physical obstacles, difficult as they were not the deepest reason they stayed. The real answer lies in identity. The Norse Greenlanders were not just people who happened to live in Greenland. They were the descendants of the first settlers. They were the children of Erik the Red, of pioneers who had carved a civilization from ice and stone. Their grandfathers were buried in the churchyards. Their farms had been in the family for 10 generations. To leave would be to admit that everything their ancestors built had failed, that the sacrifice and suffering of centuries had been for nothing. And in Norse culture, which prized honor and persistence, and family legacy above almost everything else, that admission was unthinkable. Consider what it meant to be a Norse Greenlander. Your identity was tied to place, to lineage, to the land your family owned. A man's status came from the farm his grandfather founded. A woman's honor depended on maintaining her household in the traditions passed down through generations. To abandon that land, to sail away from ancestors' graves, was not just a practical decision. It was cultural suicide. It meant admitting you were not strong enough, not worthy enough, to continue what your forefathers had begun. And for people raised in a culture where reputation and family honor mattered more than individual survival, that was a price too high to pay. Better to die on your own land than live as a failure somewhere else. Religion reinforced their determination to stay. They were Christians, believers in a God who tested his faithful. The clergy, when they still had clergy, would have preached perseverance. Suffering was holy. Hardship was a trial to be endured. God had led their ancestors to Greenland. Surely he would not abandon them now. To leave would show a lack of faith. It would be turning away from God's plan. And so they prayed, held services in their churches, baptized their children, married according to proper rites, maintained all the forms of Christian civilization, even as that civilization crumbled around them. Faith told them to endure, and they endured, far past the point where endurance made any practical sense. There is another, darker possibility. Perhaps by the time the situation became truly desperate, it was already too late to leave. Imagine the year 1400. The eastern settlement has perhaps 300 people remaining, down from thousands. Many are elderly, the survivors of earlier decades. Many are children, malnourished and weak. The healthy adults of prime working age are few. Who would crew the ships, even if ships existed? Who would navigate across hundreds of miles of open ocean? Who would arrive in Iceland with enough strength to establish themselves in a new land? The window for escape may have closed decades earlier, when there were still enough healthy people to make the attempt. But in that earlier time, the crisis did not seem fatal. It seemed survivable. A bad period, certainly, but not the end. And by the time the end became obvious, the community lacked the resources to do anything about it. This is the tragedy of gradual decline. If disaster strikes suddenly, the choice is clear: flee or die. But when decline happens slowly, over generations, there is never a single moment when leaving becomes the obvious choice. Each year is slightly worse than the last, but not so much worse that abandoning everything seems rational. You think, next year will be better. Next year the ships will come. Next year the summer will be longer. You make small adaptations. You tighten your belt. You slaughter one more cow than you wanted to. You fish more, farm less. You tell yourself you are being prudent, not desperate. And then one day, you wake up and realize there are only 50 people left, and half of them are starving, and it is far too late to sail anywhere. The Norse Greenlanders made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Stay on the land your family has held for centuries. Maintain your culture and identity. Trust that conditions will improve. These were not foolish choices. They were the choices that had worked for 300 years. But the world had changed in ways they could not fully perceive. The medieval warm period was over. The trade routes were dead. Europe had forgotten them. And the longer they waited, hoping the old world would return, the more trapped they became. Not by physical chains, but by the weight of accumulated investment, the sunk cost of generations, the psychological impossibility of admitting that everything your ancestors built was finished. There may have been debates, arguments between those who wanted to leave and those who insisted on staying. We have no records of such discussions, but human nature suggests they happened. Young people urging the community to sail for Iceland before it was too late. Old people refusing to abandon the graves of their parents. Farmers clinging to land that had been in the family since Erik the Red's time. Women worried about children too young to survive an ocean voyage. These were not easy choices with clear right answers. Every option carried enormous risk. Stay and face slow starvation. Leave and risk drowning or destitution. And in the absence of clear information about what was happening, about whether this was temporary or permanent, about whether help might still come, paralysis was perhaps inevitable. Some families did leave. The evidence suggests that the Western settlement did not die in place. People moved south to the Eastern settlement, seeking safety in larger numbers, and some likely sailed away entirely, reaching Iceland or even Norway, though they would have arrived as poor refugees whose stories were not deemed worth recording. But the majority stayed, perhaps because they could not leave, perhaps because they would not leave. The distinction in the end does not matter much. What matters is that when European explorers finally returned to Greenland in the 18th century, they found only ruins, only graves, only the silent stones of houses where people had lived and loved and made impossible choices. The question of why they did not leave haunts us because we see ourselves in it. We face our own slow-moving crises. Climate change that worsens each year but never quite catastrophically enough to force action. Economic systems that work less well each decade but not badly enough to demand revolution. Communities declining so gradually that each generation adapts to slightly worse conditions without recognizing the long-term trajectory. And we make the same calculations the Norse Greenlanders made. This is our home. Our ancestors built this. Surely it will get better. Surely we can adapt. Surely we do not need to make the drastic choice. Not yet. Not this year. Maybe next year. Maybe when things get really bad. But for the Vikings of Greenland, next year never came. There was only the slow, quiet end. And the question that no one was left alive to answer. The Norse Greenlanders are not unique in history. They are part of a pattern, one that repeats across centuries and continents. Civilizations that thrive for generations, that seem permanent and unshakable, can collapse when conditions shift faster than culture adapts. The Maya built magnificent cities in the rainforests of Central America, supporting millions of people with sophisticated agriculture. Then came decades of drought. The cities emptied. The jungle reclaimed them. The ancestral Pueblo people of the American Southwest constructed elaborate cliff dwellings and irrigation systems. A prolonged dry period arrived. Within a generation, the settlements were abandoned. The story plays out again and again, with different details but the same underlying pattern. Easter Island's Polynesian settlers found a forested paradise and built a complex society centered on carving massive stone statues. They cut down trees for rollers to move the moai, for boats to fish, for fuel and construction. By the time they realized the forests were not infinite, the last tree had fallen. Without wood for canoes, they could not fish the deep waters. Without boats, they could not leave the island. The population crashed from perhaps 15,000 to a few thousand, trapped on a deforested rock in the middle of the Pacific. They had transformed their environment so thoroughly that it could no longer support them. And by the time they understood what was happening, reversing course was impossible. Angkor Wat in Cambodia was once the heart of the Khmer Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Southeast Asia. The city supported nearly 1 million people through an ingenious system of reservoirs and canals that managed monsoon rains. But the system was fragile, dependent on careful maintenance and stable climate patterns. When droughts and floods disrupted the water supply, and when the empire's resources were stretched by wars, the management broke down. The city did not fall to invasion or plague. It simply became unsustainable. People drifted away. Within a century, the jungle had swallowed the temples. The pattern is always the same. Success built on specific conditions. Conditions that change. Adaptation that comes too slow or not at all. The Norse Greenlanders fit this pattern perfectly. They built a civilization optimized for the medieval warm period. When that period ended, they needed to fundamentally change their culture, their economy, their entire way of life. But culture is not easily changed. Identity is not flexible. The things that define who we are, the traditions and values we inherit from our parents, these are precisely the things most resistant to change. And therein lies the trap. The very cultural cohesion that allows a society to build and persist can become a prison when the world shifts. The Norse chose to remain Norse rather than transform into something new. That choice killed them. But can we honestly say we would have chosen differently? The parallels to our modern world are uncomfortable. Consider climate change. Global average temperatures have risen 1.1 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. That sounds minimal, barely noticeable. But in Greenland, a shift of 2 degrees was the difference between a functioning Norse society and extinction. Small changes in average temperature create massive changes in growing seasons, storm patterns, sea levels, and ecosystem stability. We tell ourselves we have time. That technology will solve it. That adaptation is possible. The Norse Greenlanders told themselves the same things. They adapted as best they could. They changed their diet, their farming practices, their settlement patterns. But they could not adapt fast enough, or radically enough, because true adaptation would have required becoming something they were not. Look at coastal cities today. Miami is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on pumps and raised roads to deal with sea level rise and increasing flooding. The water is coming. Everyone knows it, but the city cannot simply pick up and move. Too much investment, too much infrastructure, too many people whose entire lives are built around that place. So they adapt incrementally, buying time, hoping that future technology or changed circumstances will somehow solve what seems unsolvable. Venice is sinking. Jakarta is sinking. Bangkok, New Orleans, Alexandria, all slowly going underwater. And the residents make the same calculation the Norse made. This is home. We will find a way. We cannot imagine leaving. Until one day, perhaps, leaving is no longer an option. Economic dependence creates the same trap. Venezuela built its entire economy on oil exports. When oil prices collapsed, the nation collapsed with it. Suddenly, there was no money for food imports, for medicine, for basic services. The population faced a choice remarkably similar to the Norse Greenlanders: stay in a failing system or flee to uncertain refuge elsewhere. Millions chose to flee. Millions more stayed, unable or unwilling to abandon their homes. Detroit was once the richest city in America, built on automotive manufacturing. When that industry declined, the city had nothing to replace it. The population dropped by more than half. Those who stayed faced declining services, failing infrastructure, a slowly imploding system. Yet many remained because Detroit was home, because starting over somewhere else seemed impossible. These are not just economic problems, they are identity problems. A Venezuelan whose family has lived in Caracas for 4 generations does not easily become a refugee in Colombia. A Detroit auto worker whose grandfather built cars in the same factory does not easily transform into something else. A Norse Greenlander whose ancestors pioneered the settlement of Greenland does not easily abandon the farm that bears the family name. We are not infinitely flexible. Our identities are rooted in place, in profession, in tradition. And when those roots are threatened, we hold on tighter even as the soil erodes beneath us. This is not irrational. This is deeply, fundamentally human. But it can be fatal. The common thread in all these stories is the timing of decisions. Change happens slowly enough that each year seems manageable. Each year you can justify waiting, adapting slightly, hoping things improve. The Norse did not wake up one morning to find their civilization ended. It ended across decades, across generations, in small increments that never seemed catastrophic until it was too late. Climate warming did not kill them in a single season. It was a series of slightly shorter summers, slightly longer winters, slightly worse harvests. Trade did not stop in one dramatic moment. It was ships that came less frequently, then rarely, then not at all. Population decline was not a plague that struck overnight. It was more children dying, fewer children born, families slowly shrinking across generations. By the time the crisis became undeniable, the resources to respond were already depleted. This is the cruelest aspect of slow-moving collapse. It consumes your capacity to react even as it unfolds. The Norse by 1400 lacked the healthy population, the ships, the resources to mount an evacuation, even if they had collectively decided to leave. They had spent those resources on incremental survival, on getting through each year, on maintaining what they had rather than transforming into something new. And when transformation finally became obviously necessary, they no longer had the means to transform. The trap had closed. Not suddenly, but so gradually they never quite noticed until escape was impossible. This is the lesson that matters. Not that climate change is dangerous, we know that. Not that civilizations can collapse, history proves that. The lesson is about the nature of adaptation. Real adaptation is not incremental adjustment, it is transformation. The Inuit thrived in Greenland because they were willing to be what the environment required. The Norse died because they insisted on being what their culture required. Both made sense from their perspectives, but only one approach works when the world changes fundamentally. Strength, persistence, cultural pride, these things that we value and celebrate can become liabilities when they prevent the flexibility needed to survive. It is not the strong who endure, it is the adaptable. We face our own version of the Norse dilemma. Do we transform our energy systems, our consumption patterns, our economic structures to match a changing planet? Or do we persist with the familiar, making small adjustments, hoping innovation will let us stay essentially the same? The Norse Greenlanders chose persistence. They remained Norse until the end. They died with honor, maintaining their traditions, praying in their churches, farming their land as their ancestors had done. And then they were gone. Extinct. A warning carved in stone ruins that the world forgot for 500 years. We have the advantage of knowing their story. The question is whether we will learn from it. Whether we can choose transformation over tradition, adaptation over identity, before the choice is no longer ours to make. But history is not just about lessons. It is about people. And if you ever find yourself in Greenland, standing among the ruins of the Norse settlements, do not see only stones and grass. Do not see only an academic case study in societal collapse. See the people who lived there. The farmer who rebuilt his fence every spring, the mother who wove cloth by lamplight, the child who played with a wooden doll, the priest who said Mass in an empty church. These were real humans, as real as you or I, making impossible choices with incomplete information, doing their best to survive in a world that had turned against them. Think about the last person. We do not know who they were. A woman perhaps in her 60s, the last survivor of a community that once numbered in the thousands. She wakes in her stone house on a morning like any other. The wind howls outside. The roof is failing in places she can no longer reach to repair. She has not seen another human being in months, maybe years. The neighboring farm where her cousin once lived has been empty for a decade. She eats a piece of dried fish from dwindling stores. She tends a small fire. She goes through the motions of living because living is what humans do, even when there is no hope left. Does she remember better times? Her grandmother's stories of when the ships came from Norway, when the settlement was full of people, when there were weddings and trade fairs and a sense of connection to something larger? Those days are more myth than memory now. She knows only this: the daily struggle, the cold that never quite leaves her bones, the hunger that is always present. Does she pray? Perhaps. To a God who seems to have forgotten this place. Does she wonder if anyone will ever know she existed? Does she imagine that centuries from now, strangers will excavate her home and try to understand what her life meant? Or does she simply endure, day by day, until one day she does not wake up? That person, whoever they were, did not know they were the last. For them, it was just another winter, just another season of survival. They could not step outside their life and see the pattern, the slow extinction playing out across centuries. They saw only their own experience, their own suffering, their own small world growing smaller. And when they died, perhaps in their sleep, perhaps of cold or hunger or simple exhaustion, the Norse civilization in Greenland ended. Not with a battle cry or a final prayer recorded for posterity, but in silence, in darkness, in a stone house that would stand empty for 600 years before anyone came to ask what happened. The story of Norse Greenland is not about heroes or villains. It is not about triumph or cowardice. It is about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and making the choices they believed were right. They stayed because leaving meant abandoning everything that defined them. They held to their traditions because tradition was all they had left. They maintained their identity as Norse Christians, even as that identity became unsustainable, because identity is not something you can simply discard. They were trapped not by walls or chains, but by the weight of culture, by the inheritance of ancestors, by the impossibility of becoming something other than what they were. And in that trap, they died. But here is what matters. Their story is not over. It lives in the ruins they left behind. It lives in the objects archaeologists pull from the frozen ground. It lives in the questions historians ask about why they stayed, why they did not adapt, what their choices mean for us. Every time we tell their story, we bring them back, not as living people, but as teachers, as warnings, as mirrors reflecting our own struggles with change and identity, and the terrible weight of delayed decisions. The Norse Greenlanders failed. But their failure has meaning if we learn from it, if we recognize ourselves in their choices, if we understand that we too are making decisions today that future generations may study with the same mixture of sympathy and horror. Right now, we are writing our own chapter. We face changes that seem gradual, manageable, survivable, climate shifting, resources depleting, systems straining, and we tell ourselves what they told themselves. We have time. Technology will solve it. Adaptation is possible. We do not need to transform, not yet. These incremental adjustments will be enough. But the Norse Greenlanders made the same calculation. They adapted incrementally. They adjusted their farming, their diet, their expectations. They survived for another generation and another, making small changes that never addressed the fundamental problem. Until one day, there were no more generations. Until the civilization that had lasted 5 centuries was simply gone. We cannot know if our story will end the same way. Perhaps we will succeed where they failed. Perhaps our technology, our global communication, our scientific understanding will allow us to transform quickly enough. Perhaps we are not trapped by culture the way they were. Or perhaps we are. Perhaps centuries from now, archaeologists will excavate our cities and wonder why we did not act sooner, why we clung to systems we knew were failing, why we chose familiar comforts over necessary transformation. They will find our possessions, our buildings, our carefully preserved records. And they will ask the same question we ask about Greenland. Why did they not leave? Why did they not change? Did they not see what was coming? The difference is we know their story. We have the advantage of hindsight. We can stand in the ruins of their settlements and understand what they could not see from inside their own lives, that incremental adaptation is not enough, that some changes require transformation, that identity itself must be flexible, or it becomes a tomb. The Norse Greenlanders cannot change their ending. It is written in stone and frozen earth, but we can change ours. We can choose adaptation over tradition. We can choose transformation over cultural pride. We can choose to become what survival requires rather than insisting on remaining what we have always been. Or we can follow them into silence, into ruins, into a cautionary tale told by people who come after, If this story makes you think differently about the ruins of the past, stay with me on this journey. Because history is never just about what happened. It is about what might happen. It is about the choices we make today that determine whether future generations remember us with respect or with the sad understanding reserved for those who could not adapt in time. The Vikings of Greenland were not weak or foolish. They were human. And their humanity, their very real struggles with identity and change and impossible decisions, that is what makes their story matter. Not as a curiosity of the medieval world, but as a question posed directly to us. When your world changes, will you change with it? Or will you hold on to who you are until there is no one left to remember what that meant? The wind still blows across those stone valleys. The ruins still stand, testament to ambition and perseverance, and the limits of both. And somewhere in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can hear a question the Norse Greenlanders never got to answer. A question they leave for us. What will we choose?